This is Asia, the largest, most diverse continent, and its 4.8 billion people live in 48 completely different countries. So let's assess who's worst and who's best based on each nation's economy, safety, cost of living, corruption, freedom, and quality of life. And let's hit 10,000 likes for a video ranking every country in the Americas next. Number 48. Yemen. Home to the birthplace of coffee, millennia of ancient history, and one of the most unique ecosystems on Socotra, Yemen should be an extraordinary country. So the ongoing civil war is a real shame as it's led to one of the worst humanitarian crises and the second most dangerous nation. Just since 2015, over 150,000 Yemenis have been killed, 4.5 million displaced, and an additional 227,000 have died due to lack of food, water, or sanitation. Number 47. Afghanistan. Just 50 years ago, Afghanistan was fairly stable and an actual tourism destination. But ever since a near constant state of armed conflict started in 1978, including 3 civil wars and the 20-year-long US invasion, it's become the most dangerous country and poorest Asian nation. And ever since the Taliban regained control in 2021, the already deplorable living conditions have only worsened, leading to the world's lowest life expectancy at just 54 years. Number 46. Syria. You know a continent's got some terrible countries, when in comparison, Syria, in the midst of a 13-year civil war that's already killed over 600,000, doesn't seem that bad. But while its life expectancy, economy, safety, and sanitation standards are much better than Yemen and Afghanistan, especially in Damascus, one of the most beautiful, historic cities, it's still the third most dangerous nation, and 90% of Syrians live in poverty. Number 45. North Korea. Don't get cocky, North Korea. Literal war in the previous 3 nations is the only reason you're not last. And because nobody truly knows what life in this secretive dystopian society is like. Education is supposedly quite good, but there's no reliable information on GDP, poverty, or Human Development Index statistics. Citizens aren't allowed to leave, and any tourists are only shown an extremely restrictive propagandized tour and not allowed to communicate with locals. But what we do know is it's a complete totalitarian dictatorship with absolutely no freedom of speech and any criticism of the supreme leader resulting in labor camp, torture, or death. Number 44. Pakistan. Despite a Pakistani economist inventing the Human Development Index, the current best way to determine a nation's overall quality of life, Pakistan has one of the world's worst human development indexes. And although corruption and nepotism in all levels of government are partially to blame, the terrible education system and large amounts of extremely religious fanatics are what's truly holding this nation back. Pakistan actually has the world's worst blasphemy laws, with any person accused of criticizing Islam facing a minimum 10-year prison sentence. And many of the accused are lynched by a religious mob while the police turn a blind eye. So those were the 5 worst countries in Asia. And before we get to the other 43, make sure you leave a like and subscribe. And while the UN only recognizes Palestine as an observer state rather than a full member, 139 nations recognize its sovereignty. So if you consider Palestine to be its own country, it'd be right here on the list. Now, obviously, Gaza is not safe now, with over 30,000 Palestinians killed and 1/3 of the territory completely destroyed in just the past 3 months. But despite a corrupt government in the West Bank and many cities under Israeli control with constant surveillance and checkpoints for Palestinians, education and healthcare is actually quite good. Number 43. Myanmar. Myanmar is the only Asian nation currently under a military dictatorship. So although the decade of quasi-civilian governments from 2011 to 2021 grew the economy and halved poverty from 48 to 24%, since the military regained control 3 years ago, poverty has shot back up to 60%, and 45,000 Burmese have been killed and 2.4 million displaced in the ongoing civil war. Number 42. Timor-Leste. Despite housing the world's most biodiverse coral reefs, Timor-Leste is one of the least visited countries because not only is it extremely isolated, with Bali and Darwin, Australia being the only destinations that fly here, centuries of Portuguese rule followed by a 24-year-long occupation and genocide by Indonesia has left the nation hopelessly underdeveloped. Timor-Leste has Asia's 3rd lowest GDP per capita, and with most goods needing to be imported, the cost of living isn't cheap. Number 41. Cambodia. Cambodia has perhaps the most tragic recent history of any nation. After the US killed between 2 and 500,000 civilians from 1970 to 73, completely destabilizing the region, the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot rose to power and committed one of the worst ever genocides. Anyone perceived to have an education or opinions against a fully agrarian society was forced into labor camps or executed. Altogether, 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians, or 1/4 of the population, were killed between 1975 and 79. But although the nation is still suffering from the effects of these atrocities, with high poverty and 6 million unexploded landmines still in the country today, Cambodians are some of the warmest, most welcoming people. Number 40. Nepal. Everyone knows Nepal is the home of Everest, but the reason so many Sherpas risk their lives helping tourists reach the summit is because of how terrible normal wages are for Nepalese citizens. So yes, Nepal is the 4th cheapest country with an average cost of living of only $400 per month, but it's also Asia's 4th poorest country with an average salary of only $200 per month. Number 39. Laos. Compared to Cambodia and Myanmar, Laos is wealthy. Compared to the rest of Southeast Asia, Laos is poor. But it's not entirely its fault, as it's been plagued by terrible geography. While absolutely breathtaking, Laos is the only landlocked Southeast Asian nation, and nearly 3/4 of it is covered by mountains or hills with few fertile river valleys to grow agriculture. Laos's corrupt government and large foreign debt have contributed to the current economic crisis too, however, with annual inflation at 31% and just 20% of roads being paved. Number 38. Bangladesh. Bangladesh was blessed with the most fertile land on Earth. Yet, due to rampant corruption and oligarchy, it's the 11th poorest Asian nation. And although its economy is developing, with poverty cut in half just over the past 15 years, since it's the most densely populated non-city state, with 170 million people crammed into an area that's roughly the size of Alabama, Bangladesh has the worst pollution on Earth, and its capital, Dhaka, is a litter-infested, chaotic concrete jungle with horrendous traffic. Number 37. Turkmenistan. It's ironic that Turkmenistan's former president banned makeup, because the Orwellian capital city he built is literally all makeup. The ex-dictator had a fixation for white marble, so instead of using the nation's vast oil and gas resources to improve the economy, healthcare, or education, he built hundreds of large, expensive white marble buildings that are almost completely empty, since they're too expensive for local wages. And while the lack of civil liberties here makes Afghanistan seem like a beacon of democracy, at least poverty was low under his rule due to free gas, electricity, and water provided to all residents. However, the last president ended these provisions in 2019. Number 36. India. Just last year, India became the most populous nation, which has helped it achieve the world's 5th largest economy. But although its standard of living has vastly improved due to hundreds of billions of dollars invested in subsidizing food, electricity, health, and education, corruption is still rampant, its cities are overpopulated and filthy, and there's a huge division of wealth. Unlike its neighbors Bangladesh and Pakistan, however, India is a true democracy, and its government plans to reach a $30 trillion economy by 2047. Number 35. Iraq. Iraq has come a long way since the 8-year-long US invasion, which killed nearly 500,000 Iraqis. And yes, it is still underdeveloped, with 1/4 of the population living in poverty and 40% without access to clean water. But the cities in Kurdistan region are actually quite safe, the economy is growing, and from its landscapes to history to radiant residents, Iraq is staggeringly beautiful. Number 34. Tajikistan. With a GDP per capita of $1,100, Tajikistan is one of the poorest nations. But it's also cheap and safe, its people and culture are vibrant, and the landscapes are out of this world. Seriously, just look at the place. Number 33. Kyrgyzstan. 93% of Kyrgyzstan is covered by stunning mountain ranges, which just so happen to house an enormous gold mine. But although this, in addition to its tremendous hydropower potential, means the nation should be wealthy, corrupt governance keeps it poor. Strangely enough, however, since Kyrgyzstan is also the 9th cheapest nation, poor is actually middle class, as Kyrgyzstan has astonishingly low income inequality. Number 32. Lebanon. One of the worst liquidity crises is occurring in Lebanon, with annual inflation now at 264% and food inflation over 1,000%. And considering their incompetent, corrupt government, who's allowed terrorist groups to de facto control many areas, Lebanon has Asia's second worst infrastructure, fifth highest unemployment, constant blackouts, and a poverty rate over 70%. So despite its beautiful culture and history and life expectancy of 79 years, the Lebanese diaspora is now more than double Lebanon's population. Number 31. The Philippines. Ever since martial law was enacted from 1972 until 1986, giving the then president, who's also the current president's father, sole control of the nation, the Philippines' near perpetual corruption and debt have only gotten worse. Because rather than improve the awful infrastructure, sanitation, or education, the government constantly overspends on contracts from unqualified cronies as long as kickbacks are given that the politicians can then pocket. So although Filipinos are incredibly friendly and the 7,600 islands are magical, poverty is high, life expectancy is low, and the cities are some of the most polluted on Earth. Number 30. Jordan. Jordan is an oasis of stability and peace in an otherwise turbulent Middle East, mainly due to its strong relations with the West, receiving $1.5 billion from the US annually. But while Jordan pours enormous efforts into its diplomatic relationships, its relationship with its residents is often neglected. As a result, the stagnating economy with Asia's second highest unemployment rate is actually weaker today than it was 15 years ago. Number 29. Bhutan. Bhutan has historically been one of the most closed-off nations, and until 50 years ago, actually didn't allow any visitors. But there's also a good reason for this, as the nation deeply cares about sustainability due to it sitting in one of the world's last biodiversity hotspots. And although visitors need to pay $100 per day to visit this remarkably safe and breathtaking Himalayan nation, since Bhutan has almost no corruption, income inequality is low, and the local cost of living is pretty affordable. Number 28. Uzbekistan. Just like all the other stands, Uzbekistan is incredibly authoritarian with limited freedoms. But things are looking up under the current president, with forced labor now abolished, partial freedom of assembly now allowed, and the economy progressively liberalizing. And while the government is corrupt, at least they value education, as Uzbekistan is one of only 7 nations with a 100% literacy rate. Number 27. Iran. Machiavelli once said, "It is better to be feared than loved." And ever since the Shah was ousted in 1979, Iran's authoritarian theocratic regime has only gotten more oppressive. Today, it's the nation with the 4th worst civil liberties, with extreme censorship and thousands of peaceful protesters imprisoned, tortured, sexually assaulted, or killed every year. And as if that weren't bad enough, US and EU sanctions have led to annual inflation over 50%. But Iran is also full of beautiful, educated people, one of the richest histories and cultures, and the world's 3rd largest oil reserves. Number 26. Indonesia. Spanning 18,000 awe-inspiring islands that stretch 5,000 by 1,800 kilometers across a multitude of climate zones, Indonesia is the 2nd most biologically diverse country. But this also makes it exceptionally difficult to maintain good infrastructure outside the islands of Bali and Java. And speaking of Bali and Java, over-tourism has made Bali overpriced, while the cities on Java are overcrowded due to their disproportionate economic opportunities. In fact, Jakarta is now the world's 2nd largest metro area, as well as the most polluted city with the worst traffic. Indonesia's stable economy is rapidly developing, however, and poised to become the 5th largest within the next decade. Number 25. Vietnam. One of the poorest nations just 30 years ago, strong foreign investment and rapid industrialization have turned Vietnam into the new factory of the world, with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of manufacturing exports sent to the US, China, Japan, and Korea every year. As such, Vietnam has had one of the fastest growing economies with over 7% annual GDP growth. But while the future looks bright with an expanding middle class and plummeting poverty, corruption and nepotism are still present, and its cities are excessively crowded and polluted. Number 24. Azerbaijan. Our first transcontinental country, Azerbaijan was one of the 10 worst nations in Europe, and it made the top 25 for Asia? Well, I guess that just goes to show how tough Europe's competition was. But although Azerbaijan is safe and its vast oil and gas reserves keep poverty low, it's also effectively a dictatorship. There's a huge division of wealth, no freedom of expression, no free or fair elections, and there have been countless human rights abuses, with journalists and political opponents often imprisoned and tortured. Number 23. Armenia. Despite a 35-year-long conflict with Azerbaijan, Armenia is the world's 4th safest country. And Armenians are some of the most kind, genuine people. So it's sad that the struggling economy and rapidly increasing cost of living have resulted in a 26% poverty rate, leading to a net 40,000 Armenians fleeing the nation every year. Number 22. Mongolia. With a mere 3.4 million people spread across 1.56 million square kilometers, Mongolia is the emptiest nation. But many Mongolians love this, as it, combined with low taxes, a cheap cost of living, and the freedom to set up camp pretty much anywhere in the gorgeous countryside, means even poor people can live fairly comfortably. Especially since it's incredibly safe, the infrastructure and banking system are highly advanced, and it's the only true democracy in the region. Number 21. Sri Lanka. Having been democratically run since 1931, Sri Lanka is Asia's oldest democracy. But it's also proof that democracy doesn't always equal good, as it's ridiculously dangerous, and years of corrupt politicians' mismanagement of money and debt has led to an economic crisis, with inflation reaching as high as 70% and the nation declaring bankruptcy in 2022. And yes, things seem to have stabilized, with food, fuel, and healthcare shortages slowly recovering, but the cost of living on this jaw-dropping island is still far too expensive for locals, resulting in an exodus of hundreds of thousands every year. Number 20. Georgia. With magnificent mountains, beaches, and castles, and delicious food and wine, Georgia is one of the most fascinating nations you probably know nothing about. But while its enchanting culture and history, wild nightlife, and year-long visa-free stays make it a fantastic place to visit, local wages have never been good, and the thousands of Russians who have fled here to escape mobilization in the war with Ukraine have caused rent prices to triple in less than 2 years. Number 19. The Maldives. Despite consisting of 1,200 beautiful coral islands and atolls, most of the livable ones are just expensive private resorts, while over half of the 500,000 Maldivians are crammed onto a tiny 2-square-kilometer island, Male, which is actually the world's most densely populated capital. And sure, the nation's GDP per capita is quite high, but corruption, lack of rent control, and nearly every necessity other than fish needing to be imported means many locals struggle to get by, while external corporations pocket billions. Number 18. Russia. Well, 75% of Russia's population lives in Europe. 75% of its land is in Asia. And while its European cities are dangerous and expensive, its Asian cities are safe and cheap. Siberia's abundance of natural resources also makes it the wealthiest part of the country. Meaning, if you don't mind the lack of freedoms or extreme temperature swings from -60 to +40 Celsius, life could be worse. Number 17. Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has made huge strides in becoming more democratic, switching from a super presidential government to a presidential republic just this past year. And although corruption is still a pressing issue, Kazakhstan's vast mineral wealth, in addition to rapid globalization and digitalization, have made it by far the richest and most developed Central Asian nation, with exceptionally safe and advanced cities, a great train network, and low poverty. Number 16. China. China may be extremely authoritarian, but this has also allowed it to become the fastest developing nation in history, with poverty dropping from 89% to 1.7% in just 50 years. Because its massive investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure have not only produced a highly educated workforce and millions of good-paying jobs, but also connected every city by highway and train. In fact, despite having no high-speed rail just 20 years ago, China now has twice as much as every other country combined. But there's still a huge disparity of wealth between the rich coastal cities and poor western regions. Number 15. Thailand. From magical islands, beaches, and jungles, to its diverse culture and history, to its extraordinary animals and easygoing people who somehow always have a smile, nearly every part of Thailand is beautiful. But paradise comes with a price, and while the price of goods is low, wages are even lower as the corrupt government and concentration of wealth among just a few families have led to a stalling economy. Number 14. Oman. Due to the former sultan's emphasis on peace and neutrality since 1976, Oman is incredibly stable and often dubbed the Switzerland of the Middle East. In fact, it's the third safest nation and its currency is the third strongest. But although Omani citizens have benefited greatly from the nation's vast oil reserves, with free land, education, and healthcare given to every man, the nation is the poorest in the Gulf Cooperation Council and projected to run out of oil within 20 years. Number 13. Malaysia. While Oman never truly moved away from its heavily oil-based economy, Malaysia invested its oil wealth in educating its workforce and diversifying its economy. Due to its attractive tax incentives and highly developed cities with cheap labor costs, Malaysia successfully lured countless tech companies to become one of the largest electronics exporters. And with subsidized fuel and electricity, in addition to the excellent free healthcare system, the cost of living remains low while incomes continue to grow. Oh, and the capital has air-conditioned sidewalks. Number 12. Brunei. With less than 450,000 residents, Brunei is the smallest Asian nation and a near total welfare state. Because while its sultan, who's been in power for 57 years and is one of the last absolute monarchs left, has pocketed over $30 billion of the nation's enormous oil and gas resources, he's also covered nearly all basic needs with free healthcare, education, and highly subsidized, almost free housing. This has also backfired, however, as since even the unemployed can have a decent quality of life, nobody wants to work in non-high-paying fields. Number 11. Kuwait. Are you seeing a trend? Many of Asia's best nations aren't necessarily great due to good governance or a diverse private sector, but by sheer luck of having exorbitant amounts of oil. So while Kuwait may have been the most boring nation with the world's worst geography if oil weren't a factor, as 99.4% of it is non-arable, extremely hot desert with temperatures routinely torching 50 degrees Celsius, oil is still modern-day gold, which gives Kuwait the strongest currency and 7th highest salaries. Number 10. Saudi Arabia. Imagine a poor man finding $1 and using it to win the lottery. Now imagine that same man going to the casino to double down his winnings and hitting jackpot again to a tune of $2.3 trillion. Well, that's basically what happened to Saudi Arabia. The discovery of the world's second largest known oil reserves has given the king enough FU money to do whatever he wants, such as desalinating water for 8 million people before pumping it 500 kilometers to the otherwise waterless capital and completely terraforming the desert with the line. But while Saudi citizens are wealthy, there are also extremely limited freedoms for women, countless human rights abuses with journalists often tortured and killed, and even modern-day slavery with many immigrants having their passports confiscated upon arrival and then forced to work in terrible conditions for starvation wages. Number 9. Bahrain. A tiny island in the Persian Gulf, Bahrain is famous for oil and as the place most Saudis party, since its version of Islam is much less restrictive. In fact, an estimated 9 million Saudis vacation in the nation every year. So although Bahrain has the lowest remaining petroleum reserves in the GCC, its heavy investment in tourism as well as international banking has resulted in the least oil-dependent Gulf economy. Number 8. Turkey. Yes, Russia houses the geographic center of Eurasia, but modern-day Turkey, and particularly Istanbul, has been the world's cultural crossroads for 2 millennia. And although the European portion of Turkey is much wealthier, accounting for 30% of the nation's GDP despite covering just 3% of its landmass, Asian Turkey ain't too shabby either, with the continent's most educated populace and bustling historic cities like Izmir, Ankara, and Antalya. Number 7. Qatar. 70 years ago, a mere 25,000 people lived in the desert peninsula that's modern-day Qatar. And in just 50 years, the capital went from looking like this to this. Because despite being a 99% inhospitable desert that's smaller than the state of Connecticut, Qatar has been blessed with the world's 3rd largest natural gas and 13th largest petroleum reserves. So it's the 3rd wealthiest per capita nation, as well as the 2nd safest nation. Number 6. Cyprus. While it was part of Greece until the 1960s and is now even a part of the EU, geographically, Cyprus lies entirely in Asia. And although there's a massive wall dividing the island and capital since Turkey claims the northern portion, the southern portion's economy is booming due to its great weather and business-friendly laws attracting many tech companies. And with a delicious, healthy diet, as well as one of the best healthcare systems, the average Cypriot lives to be over 80. Number 5. The United Arab Emirates. Yes, the UAE faces many of the same migrant worker abuses that plague most Gulf nations, but its opportunities and tolerance for non-Muslim immigrants are also much better than every other Gulf nation, and its economy is the most diverse, with Dubai and Abu Dhabi transforming into business, transportation, and tourism hubs. Number 4. Israel. While every other rich Middle Eastern nation attained its wealth from oil and gas, Israel based its economy on human capital. And as such, they've invested much of the $260 billion the US has given them into its universal world-class education and healthcare systems, which have created one of the happiest, healthiest workforces with high levels of innovation and entrepreneurship. Israel also has by far the best freedom of speech in the region, the 4th longest life expectancy in Asia, and prior to the ongoing war, was one of the safest nations. Number 3. South Korea. With safe, clean, bustling big cities, breathtaking countryside, and Asia's 3rd best life expectancy, infrastructure, and schools, as well as the world's fastest internet, 10th strongest economy, and 3rd best healthcare, South Korea isn't just elite by Asian standards. It's one of the best nations on Earth. But its culture of overworking combined with gloomy weather has also led to the planet's highest suicide rate. Number 2. Japan. From its vibrant culture and history, to its mouth-watering healthy food, to its welcoming people, diverse landscapes, exceptional safety, low corruption levels, and incredible education, transportation, and megacities, Japan doesn't just offer something for everyone. It offers the best for everyone. And sure, the economy's been stagnant for the last 30 years, but that just shows how remarkable it was, as it's still the world's 3rd strongest economy, despite an aging population. Number 1. Actually, we're gonna have another honorable mention. Taiwan. Because while Taiwan is independently governed and very much functions as its own nation, only 13 UN nations agree, since China claims to own it and most countries don't want to ruin their relations with China. But if Taiwan were officially recognized, it would have the world's 14th strongest economy due to 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors being produced here, and rank among the top 10 nations in most important categories. But it would still only be Asia's 2nd best country. Actual number 1. Singapore. Singapore might be the most unique nation in history, because while freedoms are heavily suppressed, its government is also the least corrupt, which, combined with its strategic location and business-friendly laws, catapulted it from a developing nation just 50 years ago to the 2nd wealthiest one today. But although the government continues to invest in its people with the best roads, healthcare, education, safety, and cleanliness in the world, did you know 8 countries in Europe actually have a higher quality of life? If you want to find out which, there's a video on screen now. Go check it out.